What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video I'm very happy to be starting my series of reviews on the Alien franchise, a franchise that I've wanted to cover here on the channel since the very beginning. And in my early days I actually randomly covered the first Predator film, never covered any of the other ones, and so I've been wanting to do a full deep dive of all the aliens, of all the Predators leading up to Alien vs Predator 1 and 2, and just talk on these very iconic franchises, the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful, whatever the case may be. And it felt incredibly fitting to finally start talking about the Alien films, as we're only a few months away from the latest installment in the franchise, Alien Romulus. So without further ado, let's take a trip back to 1979 for Ridley Scott's Alien. Of course, directed by Ridley Scott, this film is written by Dan O'Bannon and Ronald Shusett and stars people like Sigourney Weaver, Tom Skerritt, John Hurt, Yaphet Kotto, Ian Holmes, and many more. So I think it goes without saying that if you were a big cinephile, if you're a big fan of sci-fi, Alien is one of the most iconic films in that genre, and without a doubt, one of the most influential for its time. Of course, coming 2 years after one of my favorite films was ever created, which was Star Wars, and clearly inspired by it, it took its own approach into the sci-fi genre, taking us into a much darker tale that would introduce one of the most iconic movie monsters of all time, the Xenomorph, that completely encapsulated what the term alien would be. There's been so many alien films, but when people talk about alien or aliens, you know exactly which creature they're referring to. That's the Xenomorph. It's one of the most iconic designs in all of cinema, and it has been one of those characters or one of those monsters that has appeared in various other forms of crossovers and just tons of artwork with other franchises. The Xenomorph, without a doubt, is one of the coolest looking monster designs of all time. And as a kid, I used to love the Alien films just because of the Xenomorphs. I loved the way they looked. I loved the overall feel of the characters. I loved how scary they could be and how intense they can be in so many moments. And even in some of the weakest installments in this franchise, the Xenomorph is always my favorite part of any of those films. And it had been quite some time since I had gone back and revisited these films, especially some of the newer ones that I've only seen maybe twice. I've only seen Alien Covenant, I think, the one time I saw it. So I'm looking forward to rewatching all of these films, and going back and watching the 1979 one, it just brought back fond memories of being a kid and catching these on cable all the time. I have so many fond memories of back in the day, pre-streaming, just being able to watch this or rent it from Blockbuster with my mom or my dad and just watch this movie. It was a film that both tantalized me while also creeping me out in so many other ways, and it just has so much about it that really thoroughly works. But the question is, what do I think about it now in 2024 at the age of 30, almost 31, when I was watching this as a kid back in the day? But before we do that, let's talk on what this movie is all about. The movie opens up and we're introduced to a ship known as the Nostromo, and we're quickly introduced to the fact that all of the crew members are in cryostasis as they are currently on transport back home to Earth, and we end up learning pretty quickly that this is a mining craft. They go around to different planets, different rocks, meteors, different things like that, and mine those planets. But they're woken up early from their cryostasis, and they're a bit confused as to why, only to discover the fact that there's a distress call coming from a nearby rock, moon, meteor. Honestly, at this very moment, I can't remember, but there's a distress call coming from nearby. They land, they go to see what's going on, and end up coming across a spacecraft, which will become far more important in future installments, most notably a prequel known as Prometheus. And so we end up getting into this spacecraft, and one of the individuals who's in this crew of the Nostromo, played by John Hurt, the late great John Hurt, who I've always loved, ends up coming across a bunch of eggs, and it opens up to reveal another one of the most iconic movie monsters and one of the coolest creature designs of all time, the face hugger that jumps straight onto his face and latches itself there, rendering him unconscious. And then the rest of the team decide to bring him back to the ship. Of course, they're scared. They don't know what this thing is. They don't know what's going on. They make the poor choice of keeping him out of quarantine to get him onto the ship to try to save his life. They end up getting this thing off of his face eventually, only to unfortunately discover that this thing has impregnated him with a creature that is inside of him now and will burst out of his chest later on, birthing a Xenomorph, and they now have an alien creature on their spacecraft in the middle of space. Man, Alien is one of those films that is iconic. Visually, the musical score, the overall look, the feel, the vibe. Now, with it coming out 2 years after the first Star Wars film, it is hard to watch this film and not clearly see the inspiration that Star Wars was just a few years later with this movie coming out, in terms of its aesthetic and a lot of the noises for a lot of the spacecraft movements, the doors, different things like that. There was a lot that was clearly inspired by by Star Wars. But I think that Ridley Scott and the team behind this film did an incredible job of giving it its own identity when it comes to tone, and of course, as I mentioned before, introducing one of the scariest and coolest monsters of all time, the Xenomorph. And of course, this film would end up really blowing Sigourney Weaver up as one of the biggest action stars, one of the biggest badass women stars of all time, of course, as the character of Ripley. Now, while most of the stuff that people mostly know Ripley for is for the sequel, there's without a doubt she is a standout in this movie as well. So now that throughout the course of the rest of the movie, the remaining cast members who are still on board are obviously terrified as they learn that there is this creature on board that is slowly picking one of them off, one at a time, and of course they have to do what they can to try to destroy this Xenomorph by the end of it. And going back and revisiting it, I had such a blast. I think the movie looks great, it's performed really well. Watching it today, while there are some elements that are dated about it when it comes to some of the sci-fi elements, I think that's always funny with older sci-fi films that are trying to come across incredibly futuristic. There is that part of it now where we have gone into the future, we have gone into this point where a lot of the technology they're using that's supposed to seem so much more futuristic is just more of a dumbed down version of what we currently have, and then some of those ideas for things that we don't currently have in the world don't really necessarily seem as cool because of what their idea of futuristic was in this film. It doesn't take away from the charm of this film, but it is something worth mentioning that I think is a little goofy when you go back and watch it. Outside of that, I will say that it was a little bit slower at times than I remembered, with a lot of the alien action being left to the very end of the film, very much like the film Jaws, where you don't really see the shark all that much until you get to the tail end of the film. On one hand, I enjoyed that, but at times as I was watching this film, there was a part of me that felt, well, this is a little bit slower than I remember. But what I can really highlight this film for is its moments that keep you intrigued and engaged. While this isn't a film that I think is necessarily jam-packed with great character development, nor is it a film that I think has the strongest human narrative that you're following here, it is a film that really builds on tension, utilizing its sets, its locations, sound design, and the musical score to really heighten a lot of moments. It is also a film where the performances all feel incredibly natural. While I don't feel like we spend a whole lot of time with a lot of the characters, there are a bunch of characters here that we'll get into in a moment that kind of feel just like they're standing there, or they're there for a few lines of dialogue, or to scream or be killed at a certain point in the film. I think for the most part, what I really enjoy is that you have this group of people that are on this ship that ultimately feel like real people, and they feel like they really get to know each other, or that they really know each other as a whole. And one of the places you can see that the most is in the iconic scene with the chest burster. Of course, you know, as I mentioned before, that John Hurt's character had the face hugger, it impregnates him, and of course the Xenomorph is birthed through his chest. And if you watch that scene, one of the coolest parts about it is that they shot that closer to the end of filming, so that in that scene where they're all kind of sitting and having dinner with one another, that they could all feel like friends. Ridley Scott wanted the crew on this ship to feel like they all knew each other, and while that is a decent bit into the film, he wanted that scene to feel like all these characters really knew each other, all these actors were very comfortable with each other, and you can feel that when you watch the scene. It feels like a bunch of people who do know each other. It doesn't feel like there's a lack of chemistry between these people. They feel like they've had experienced time together. And one of the coolest scenes about that as well is that outside of John Hurt, the rest of the cast knew something was going to happen in that sequence, but they didn't know exactly what it was. So when the blood splatters from the center of John Hurt's chest and splatters all across the rest of the cast, their reactions are incredibly realistic because they were realistic. They didn't know exactly what was going to happen. They knew something was going to happen, but it came to them as a surprise. And watching that sequence, knowing that fact, I think is so great. I've always loved the way that Ridley Scott approaches certain sequences to get the most realistic performances from his performers. And in this film, moments like that are definitely something you can highlight as some of the best moments in all of the Alien franchise that continue today to be one of the most iconic scenes of all time. Now, while I mentioned that I don't think that all the actors and characters in this film get a whole lot to do, some of the people who are definitely standouts here are, of course, Sigourney Weaver as the character of Ripley, a character that doesn't really seem like she's the main character for the first portion of the film, but ultimately is the last surviving member on the Nostromo and has to take things into her own hands, with her becoming the main character by the time we're leading into the third act. She has a lot to do throughout the course of the film, but there is a portion of the film at the very beginning where it doesn't really feel like the film's focus is really on her, which is an intriguing way to kind of paint a main character in the story. It kind of reminded me a little bit of watching The Nightmare on Elm Street, where at the beginning of the film, it almost seems more like Tina is the main character, only for her to be killed off very shortly into the film, and of course Nancy to become the main character of the film. But outside of Sigourney Weaver, another cast member you have to talk about when you talk about Alien is the actor Ian Holm, of course, who plays Ash, who seems to be, at the very beginning of the film, just another crew member on this ship. But of course, we learn near the end of the film, had his own objective that was given to him by their overseers to essentially bring that ship back with this alien creature on it and to preserve it in some way if he can. And we end up learning that he is not working with the crew, but actually against them with his own agenda, and ultimately is an android of sorts. It's a robot. We end up seeing him get decapitated here as they have to try to fight him off, and Ian Holm gives a great performance here. I've always enjoyed him as an actor. He would end up reprising that role in a video game that came out about a decade or so ago known as Alien Isolation, a really great first-person horror alien game that I've actually really enjoyed playing in the past. And I've also really enjoyed seeing him in things like the Lord of the Rings franchise, of course, as the older Bilbo Baggins. So yeah, I love him in this film. I like the role of Ash in this film. I like the deception around his character. While there's some, goofier practical effects used around the prosthetics for him later on as he's been killed and decapitated, there's a lot about his character that's definitely intriguing while you're watching the film. And I think that him, as well as Sigourney Weaver's Ripley, are without a doubt the most interesting characters in the film. And with that, I just want to wrap this up with some of my negatives, which is that, like I said before, I do think that there are portions of this film that are a little bit slow. And as somebody who is a big fan of character work and story before anything else in a movie, there are a lot of characters that we follow here on the Nostromo who ultimately are just there to be fodder for the Xenomorph, say a couple of lines of dialogue here and there, but ultimately aren't really characters you ever feel like you get to know or care for. Some of the most notable ones in that category for me would be the characters of Lambert and Parker, played by Veronica Cartwright and Yaphet Kotto. I enjoy their characters here. There are moments where they can be funny and that they add to the scene, but there really isn't an abundance done with them narratively that ever really warrants their existence in this film. And going back and revisiting it, that was my biggest gripe, was that there's a really cool movie here that I really love, that I think is a fantastic film. And I think a lot about its practical effects, its creativity, its creature design, its costume work, of course, on the Xenomorph, which is all practical in this film. The overall aesthetic of the film, the performances that all feel so natural, the creepy tone, all of that is done so well. And I think the only thing that holds this film back from being absolutely great in every capacity for me going back and revisiting it in 2024 is simply that lack of characterization across so many of the characters that are in this film. There is a bit of a lack of a narrative structure when it comes to some of these characters that ultimately just kind of leaves them feeling like random side characters in the film. But with all that said, if you can't already tell from the rest of this review, I think Alien is a fantastic and iconic and influential film that of course took from sci-fi films before it, but would go on to inspire more people when it comes to sci-fi and horror. It does so much to have its own identity, and again, introduced one of the coolest monsters of all time, the Xenomorph. So that's going to be my thoughts on the first Alien film. Look very soon here on the channel for my review on the sequel, Aliens, and I look forward to getting to Aliens 3, Aliens 4, Prometheus, Covenant, and all the rest of that. Alien vs. Predator, I will probably get to after I cover the rest of the Predator films, but hopefully I'll be able to get all of that done before Alien Romulus comes out later this year. So I definitely look forward to hearing from you guys. What's your favorite film in the Alien franchise? What are your thoughts on this original film? And if you like more reviews like this for older movies, definitely hit that subscribe button down below. Hit that like button if you guys enjoyed the video. Comment your thoughts, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.